Now, we are just months away from the US presidential election, and as things stand, it looks exceptionally likely that Donald Trump will be re-elected, a far more vengeful Donald Trump. He has just appointed his vice presidential pick, JD Vance, who has gone from never Trumper to a extreme right-wing Trumpian Republican. Joe Biden visibly flailing before us. His polling is catastrophic, but the Democratic machine divided, but Biden remains in place. No better person to speak to than the brilliant reporter Ryan Grimm, who formerly of The Intercept, but now has just set up, along with the also brilliant reporter Jamie Scarhill, Drop Site News. Do check that out. I'll include a link to that. They do brilliant independent investigative work on domestic US politics, but also foreign policy, war. So make sure you check that out. Ryan, it's a big honor to speak to you as ever. How you doing?
I'm good, Owen. How you doing?
Great. So let's start, shall we, with JD Vance, who is a few days older than me and is now the vice presidential nominee. Now, could you just explain this guy? Because he was a never Trumper, wasn't he? He was like, "Oh, I might have to vote for Clinton over Trump back in 2016." Where's he at? What's his political sort of journey been? Where's he at? What's the significance of this appointment?
So he grew up kind of poor and working class, raised by a single mom, as anybody knows who's read, Hillbilly Elegy or Hillbilly Elegy or seen, I guess, the resulting cinematic portrayal of it. And from there went to Yale, and from there went into kind of Peter Thiel world and like venture capital, became super rich, and then went and wrote this book and sold the book basically to liberals who were at the time trying to understand this raging white working class that was getting behind Donald Trump. And so they turned it into a bestseller. It's a well done book. You don't have to like the politics of it, which I don't. The politics of it are basically like typical 1980s kind of right-wing reactionary politics aimed at the Black community, saying it's all a problem with personal responsibility and laziness, except instead you take that lens, that reactionary lens, and you apply it to Appalachia in the United States. Say that, it's the problem is the culture of these poor white people is laziness, etc. But the book as a piece of craft is well done. It becomes this huge bestseller. And so you have to understand that at the time that he's becoming this famous author, his entire base, so to speak, is kind of rich white liberals in Manhattan. And so it's not surprising that, he kind of parroted their politics back to them at the time. Say, like, thank you for, making my book into a movie. Thank you for making a bestseller. Here, I'll tell you what you want to hear, which is that Donald Trump is an ogre. He's Hitler, he called him at one point. And so there's a lot of criticism of Vance that perhaps he changed his politics in order to, cozy up to Trump once he saw the power of Trump, and he went from a never Trumper to a Trump supporter. But in fact, it's to me, it's more likely that he was lying the first time around when he was talking to his kind of rich liberal audience and was telling them what they wanted to hear. And the fact that he's got such deep roots with Peter Thiel suggests that he's always been this kind of that figure that would fit into this kind of populist nationalist right. And so what it does show is that Trump is extremely confident about the polling. Like the knock on him, the knock on picking him, was that there was no reason to think that he was going to kind of add anything to the ticket electorally. He doesn't check any boxes on that front. So the fact that he's adding him suggests that to Trump, Vance is a luxury that he can afford at this point because he's polling so well.
With Vance, let's just see this little clip just to kind of flesh that out.
By the way, I have to beat up on the UK. Just one additional thing. I was talking with a friend recently, and we were talking about, one of the big dangers in the world, of course, is nuclear proliferation, though, of course, the Biden administration doesn't care about it. And I was talking about, what is the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? And we were like, maybe it's Iran, maybe Pakistan already kind of counts. And then we sort of finally decided maybe it's actually the UK, since Labour just took over. But But to my Tory friends, I have to say, you guys have got to get a handle on this, but neither here nor there.
So that's a clip, him talking about Britain as the first Islamist country now Labour have taken over. He's also talked about, about this basically being America being like the late Roman Republic in need of a Caesar. And how all civil servants should be fired and replaced with our people. It's I'll be honest, Ryan, it's giving dictatorship. It's giving just a right-wing tyranny where they're talking about needing a Caesar and metamorphosizing into the Roman Empire from the Roman Republic. Is this a genuine threat? Is this just me being hysterical? Is this just hysteria?
I mean, this is also standard issue stuff for Republicans at this point. And so you have to understand that Republicans believe that the entire quote unquote deep state, whatever you think of the deep state, the broad bureaucracy, the broad administrative state is stacked largely by liberals with college and graduate degrees, who actively worked to thwart the Trump administration the first time around. There's no question that huge elements of the administrative state have Democratic leanings and were generally hostile to Trump when he was president. Like that is a fact. Since then you've had a whole series of different elements of pushback that the right has come up to say, like, okay, next time we get back into power, here's what we're going to do. Part of that includes the Supreme Court recently with this case overturning what's known as Chevron, which basically makes it extremely difficult for the administration to do anything without kind of congressional approval, which kind of runs contrary to the Supreme Court and the Trumpian push for a unitary executive. But what it will do is it'll kind of disempower the administrative state, and not necessarily empower Congress, but it'll in a Republican presidency will empower the president. There's also this thing called Schedule F, which would allow the president, to get rid of civil servants in ways that override this kind of civil servant protections that we've had in place for 100+ years. Now, on the one hand, you could see that leading towards some sort of authoritarianism. On the other hand, democracy does require that a new administration ought to be able to govern, ought to be able to put in place, people in positions of power who agree with the agenda that people elected them on. So to me, it's there's two separate issues. There's whether you believe this is, that their ultimate goal is authoritarianism, but then underneath that, whether some of these steps actually are legitimate. And from a democratic perspective, it does actually, to me, at least seem fair that an administration ought to be able to put in place personnel. Like if a Bernie Sanders had won the White House in 2016, I would want Bernie Sanders to be able to staff his administration with people, who share the Bernie Sanders agenda that the American people in that instance would have voted for. The question then comes, are they going to be able to hold on to power in the face of the Democratic will to throw them out when that eventually comes? And that's a more complicated question. Let's talk about that for a little bit, because I think people miss the role of the military here. Essentially, any dictator who has taken over anywhere, has had to do so with some combination of taking control of the military apparatus or in concert and in conspiracy with the military. And the problem Trump has is that our military, as it's currently structured, is deeply hostile to any kind of role in governing, and is hostile to the idea that the military is going to override kind of civilian government. And I'm skeptical that Trump in 4 years would be able to find enough people to kind of reform the military in such a way that it would become an ally of his. And at the same time, even though the Supreme Court is this reactionary right-wing vehicle, they're not necessarily a Trumpian vehicle. And so the Trumpist movement at this point still lacks the Trumpist movement to become authoritarian and to remain in power, does not have the military or the Supreme Court yet. Doesn't mean that those entities are by any stretch kind of progressive, but they have a ways to go until they're able to consolidate that power.
So, I mean, when Trump talks at the moment about, I don't know, military tribunals for his opponents, locking his opponents up, suspending the US Constitution, when he's asked, will you be a dictator? And he said, only on day one. You know, is it just hot air? Is it just rhetoric? Will he actually just end up? And also the fact that a lot of the kind of relative so-called moderate part of his entourage have all kind of left. So the people have just become more extreme by attrition. Well, I don't know. How serious is that? Do you think, is he just pontificating?
It's not totally hot air. I think it's real. I think they represent very authentic impulses on his part. But I think that he's going to take, power consolidation much more seriously than he did last time. I don't think that means he'll take governing more seriously, but I think, picking JD Vance, who's going to be a total loyalist, shows that he wants to surround himself with loyalists and is girding for this internal fight. But the power in the United States is still decentralized to significant degrees, and you've got governors who do not report. You've got governors who do not report to the president. You can have conflicts over who can control the National Guard. But as long as the military is kind of the bulwark, if our military was ever going to get involved in politics, the only way I could see it would be a reverse coup, like ousting Trump, which a bunch of liberals would cheer, but I think would be a disaster for the United States too. But the politics of it are still a climb for Trump to kind of just completely take over now. It's gonna get dicey. To your question, if it's real, it's real. Like, it's a live fight. It's on, but it's not over, is what I would argue.
I mean, what would worry me a bit, for example, is so the former Defense Secretary Mark Esper wrote in his memoir that Donald Trump, he tried to demand that Black Lives Matter protesters were shot, which was also, I think, said by General Mark Milley as well, who called him a wannabe dictator. Is Trump, for example, comes to power, there's a big response on the streets. He then orders them to be shot, and then that causes an ever bigger cycle, which he then uses to impose authoritarian measures up to and including the threat of martial law. I mean, do you see what I mean? I could just. What do you think?
Yes, and then his problem becomes: does he get the military to implement something like that, or does the military say no? Like, we do not. This is outside of the bounds of our constitutionally delegated authority, so we're not going to do this. But it's an open question, and it's a risk. And the question of who checks him, is an important one, and it's not obvious. So, like, let's say that there's, he does succeed in getting them to open fire. You recently had this Supreme Court case that said, the president is immune if he's taking an official act. Suppressing civil unrest would certainly seem to fall within what you'd call an official act of a president. So now that's legal. Nobody can check him on it. And each notch that you move forward, each turn of the screw there, gets difficult to move back. And then perhaps you can then, through that, change the culture of the military to one in which it is becoming more Trumpian.
I mean, there's this Project 2025, which is a far-right blueprint, which has been coordinated by the Heritage Foundation, which is a hard-right think tank, which produces kind of blueprints for this sort of thing. I mean, just kind of the gist of that project, but how serious do you think that is? I mean, Donald Trump's trying to distance himself from lots of it. It's not popular, according to the polling, much of it, and the Democrats are very keen to tie him to it. I mean, what's the kind of Project 2025 agenda, and do you think it's do you think it's that plausible?
Yeah. So It shows the seriousness for sure of the reactionary right. Some of Project 2025, and for instance, it's it's like stuff like banning IVF, the kind of thing that is just utterly toxic to Republicans nationally. And if Trump still does lose, which is still within the realm of possibility, it will be because of that sort of thing. IVF, their anti-abortion push, like there is still an extraordinary amount of hostility towards Republicans on that question. If you look at basically in every state that Democrats need to win the presidency, their Senate candidate is winning fairly comfortably, like not blowing it out, but fairly comfortably, which shows that the country right now is leaning Democratic, which makes it such a crazy twist of historical fate that they may elect Donald Trump anyway. And so that's why Donald Trump is distancing himself from this Project 2025, because it has a lot of this politically toxic cultural stuff that he is both completely embedded in and intertwined with, because he nominated 3 Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade, and evangelical Christians were his most loyal supporters, and basically they gave him the White House in 2016. They broke just a hair, 5% or so less than 2020, and it probably cost him the election. Like those are his people. That's who he needs. But the reason he would distance himself from him, because it's just stuff that turns off the rest of the country. But yes, it does show that now this Trump movement has had 8 years to kind of formulate an agenda, whereas it was just riffing off the top of Trump's head when he launched in 2015.
With Biden, I mean, I'd say from the outside perspective, when you see a lot of, I mean, I see this online, I mean, it's the kind of ultra Biden, till I die type stuff, spinning every appearance he makes. And it does, if I'm honest, look crazy from the outside, because he's clearly declined very steeply. And if he's declined this steeply in quite a relatively short period of time, and he's been declining for a while, you kind of think, what's he going to be like in a year? He's not, the idea of him serving a 4-year term is deranged. So I'm just wondering, just on that, what do you think? Is there any chance? Do you think he'll lead the Democrats into as the presidential nominee?
It's certainly looking that way. You have Nancy Pelosi, fighting hard in the background. Nancy Pelosi is no longer Speaker of the House or Democratic House leader, but is still, extraordinarily powerful Democrat, and she's working overtime to try to, crowbar him out of the top spot. A lot of other top Democrats are trying to do the same, but are also now engaged in these quite cynical calculations of, okay, if we oust Trump as the nominee and replace him presumably with Kamala Harris, then we have now used our agency and therefore have some responsibility for the outcome. They're thinking, if we do nothing and we just let Biden stay as the nominee and he loses, then that's not on us. And so it's these basic cynical calculations that are going on. But what that also suggests is that some of these Democratic leaders do not believe their own rhetoric about the end of democracy in 2024. A lot of the candidates, like Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, JB Pritzker, Josh Shapiro, they're all taking this like backseat approach and saying, let's see how this plays out in 2024. Doesn't look great for me here. I'm waiting for 2028. So all of these politicians are thinking through, what their own politics look like in a post 2024 era, where if they were convinced that a Trump victory actually did mean the end of democracy, it would be completely absurd for them to be contemplating what their electoral future was after that. And so either they're totally insane and delusional, which is possible, or their rhetoric around the end of democracy is rhetoric, and that then they don't themselves believe that that's actually going to happen.
Ryan, really insightful stuff as ever. And you can see why Dropsite News will be very insightful, nuanced, thoughtful, some of the best journalism around by both the likes of Ryan and his great colleague, Jeremy. So do check that out. Do leave your comments, press like, subscribe. But Ryan, as ever, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Owen.